Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, where trauma survivors become healthy thrivers. Each month, we'll feature a theme in the trauma recovery and empowerment field. To promote your recovery, healing, and learning how to build dreams, here's your host, Karen Robinson, transformational coach and therapist.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast. Today, our guest is Ms. Sylvia Worsham. Sylvia received 3 miracles during 72 hours during Easter weekend in 2012. She traded off her multiple award-winning sales career of Pfizer and Roche to become the author, multilingual speaker, and turning points coach she is today. Sylvia lives her passion by helping entrepreneurs and professionals who are in deep spiritual change in life navigate towards their divine soul's purpose and align to their soul's identity. She does this through her joy in the Journey Masterminds, Keynote Addresses, and one-on-one coaching. Sylvia resides in Austin, Texas with her amazing husband, 2 children, and her dog. Welcome, Sylvia.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Karen. I really appreciate it.
Oh, we're delighted to have you here. So I have lots of questions for you.
I'm sure.
So the first is, I'm very curious about the 3 miracles you had within 72 hours. Got to hear all about that.
That was very traumatic. That was in 2012, and
Okay.
I'd been admitted to St. Luke's Episcopal Hospital. And the night before, I had jolted awake with like a very painful knife-piercing pain in my chest. And I was traveling with my young son. He was 6 at the time, and we were meeting my boyfriend. We were going to be driving to Louisiana the next day. We were in Houston, Texas. And I remember hearing the voice of the Holy Spirit say, lean forward and you'll be able to breathe. And so I do. I lean forward. And I had met with my brother, who was a doctor, and I had asked him about a certain pain I was getting. I thought it was due to my stress because I was working the 50 to 60-hour work weeks at Pfizer. And he was like, oh, you're young, and typical family response. Here, take this, you'll be okay. Very low key. And somewhere deep inside of me that night, I just felt like something was off. You know, my intuition was really on. And I was so glad I listened to that prompting to lean forward, because I do that for 4 hours. And the next morning I call my brother and I'm like, this pain is just too weird. You know, there's just something about it. And when he finds out that I'd taken a flight, he was like, get to the ER immediately. And so we are luckily in the medical center here in Texas and Houston. And I walk into one of the best hospitals in the country, St. Luke's Episcopal Hospital, and they do a scan of my lungs. And in walks this very powerful, very direct doctor into my room and says, you know, a woman in your condition should not be sitting up talking to me. That pain you felt were 2 blood clots that traveled through your heart to get to your left lung. So now you've got pulmonary embolisms everywhere. And for those that don't know what that is, it's basically your blood clots and it travels, and it can block your heart or it can give you a stroke. It could do multiple things to you. And most people die from one. I had multiple. And so I get admitted, and he said, you know, there's something else wrong with your liver. So we're going to admit you in stable condition, but we have to run more tests. And the next morning they run more tests, and in walk 6 doctors inside my hospital room. And I knew it was bad because none of them would look me in the eye. And they basically stated in not so many words that I was facing a liver transplant and possible liver failure because I had a massive blood clot that was blocking the blood supply to my organ.
Wow.
And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, I'm like 37 years old. I'm a single mom. I found the love of my life. And they start talking about what they're going to do. Like, my case is not a case they've seen before. And so they said, we're going to do something a little bit off the books. And if that doesn't work, then the interventional route could actually kill you. So we're hoping this other route will be helpful. And so they start infusing me with this medicine. But when they explain it, those commercials when they talk about medicines and
the
they
side
tell
effects
the
are
things,
worse.
yeah, and they open up the whole list. You're like, I kind of don't want to know. But when they got to death and hemorrhagic stroke, my heart just kind of like did a pitter patter. And my mind went blank, Karen. And I just kind of, the visualization was of falling into God's arms, because I was in full and total surrender at that point. I had zero control. And the doctors didn't think I was going to survive the night. In fact, they told my entire family, who are physicians, that I had a 20% chance of surviving. And so it was very grim. And the next morning, I wake up, luckily, and a woman with the Catholic diocese walks into the hospital room, and she looks at her papers and she said, do you want to pray with me? And I remember my boyfriend was in the room with me. And so we formed a circle and we started reciting the Our Father. And halfway through the prayer where it says, thy will be done, we felt this immense presence in the room. And I remember feeling this love like I've never felt before, ever here on earth. And I felt safe and at peace when I should have been terrified, because I hadn't found out what had happened and what the choices were. And when she leaves the room, my boyfriend, Donnie, turns to me and says, you felt them too, didn't you? So that was the second miracle I received. And the third and final miracle was just 20 minutes later. I knew in my heart I was fine. God had saved me. He had heard my prayers. And they wheeled me in, and within 20 minutes, I got the response I was already expecting, which was, there is no more threat. There is no, it's as if you had never had pulmonary embolisms before. There's nothing left in you. You're totally clear. And more importantly, you don't have long-term effects, because when you have blood clots that end up in your lung, they can leave holes in your heart, in your lung, and you can have these complications that can last years. And they were utterly mystified. How did this happen? And so that's the third and final miracle. And that happened within 72 hours on Easter weekend in 2012. So that's the story.
Wow. That was amazing.
It's traumatic.
Yeah.
It's traumatic and it's life-changing, and it's so many things packed up into one, in all honesty.
Yeah. Had you had any kind of medical history prior to this?
Nope.
No.
I was perfectly healthy. I was exercising 7 days a week. I was in the best shape I had ever been in. In my whole life, even from high school years, I was thoroughly amazed. And that's why my brother didn't think it was anything complicated like this. He thought it was something that it was very common in young people who exercise. And so he didn't think much of it until he realized I had taken a flight. And that alone should have killed me.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't.
I bet that scared him to death. Let's see.
It scared my entire family. And they're not easily scared because they're doctors. They've seen it all, right? Mm-hmm. But when I remember getting a phone call from my sister, who's also a physician, and she was crying on the phone. And I'm sitting there in ICU thinking, I'm the one in ICU. I should be the one crying. Why are you crying? But they didn't want to tell me my odds of beating this thing. They kept it quiet for obvious reasons. Emotionally, it would have really taken its toll. I mean, they're trying to help me stay calm and not anxious. And I had already needed oxygen and morphine and all these other things that kind of complicated that. So they had all decided, you know what, we'll just keep it to ourselves. We'll let her know when she survives it. And then we'll let her know. She had a 20% chance of surviving. That was very helpful. So,
yeah. Prior to this event, did you have any other kind of traumas, like interpersonal traumas in your family, any assault or anything you feel comfortable talking about?
I had bullying as a child in high school. That was very traumatic because, speaking of mental health and a lot of children that get bullied, I was lucky that I had a mother who was very involved and who was truly my best friend growing up. And so the line of communication was always open with her. And I never felt so threatened that I wanted to take my own life. But I do know a lot of children that feel like they have no other way out but through suicide because they feel so attacked daily. And I was attacked daily verbally, not physically, because I was an athlete and I could outrun my bullies. Quite a few times I did. But they did gang up on me. And what was very painful was that one of them had been my best friend in 8th grade. And that was very telling because the entire 4 years of high school, I was bullied. And I was very lucky in that I was an old soul and I got along very well with my teachers and they protected me. They offered rooms of protection during certain hours of the day so that I could relieve myself from the constant verbal abuse. And I detailed that in Journey to Me in the hopes that parents that read it who have children or potentially themselves were bullied could navigate through that and ask themselves certain prompting questions to get to the root of the beliefs that formed during those years that can be potentially driving or steering their choices in life, choices that are not aligned to that beautiful person they were created to be.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear about the bullying. I know that's really tough for anyone of any age, especially for young people. Since you mentioned one of your books, maybe this would be a good time to tell our audience more about the books you've written and what inspired you to write them. So we know one of them was inspired by your childhood bullying. You want to say more about that?
Well, sure. Journey to Me was actually a prompting I received, interestingly enough, in 2010 after I'd watched Eat, Pray, and Love. I was outside the theater with about 3 girlfriends, and I remember hearing the idea in my head, persistent thought of write the Hispanic version of Eat, Pray, and Love, because at the time I was in deep spiritual change. It was right after my first divorce. And I was going through a lot of changes in my life and a lot of shifts. But I was so afraid of failing, Karen, that I neglected to act on the prompting for 10 years. And then the pandemic hit in Austin in 2020, and the prompting got very, very strong. Write your book, it's time, trust me. And I had journeyed and developed a very deep relationship with God right after my divorce and my near-death experience in 2012. And it had only gotten more of a relationship. It shifted from believing in him to trusting him with my life and surrendering and accepting my path. And so Journey to Me was really an answer to a prompting. And at first I didn't know what to write about, but as I asked God to share with me what it is that he needed me to discuss in Journey to Me, the more the ideas and the downloads started to come. And I remember memories of having women in particular come up to me and ask me, how did I transition from corporate America through stay-at-home parent to now the author and speaker that I was today, because they thought it had been such a dramatic change I had undertaken that how had I done it successfully? And that kept coming up over and over and over again. So the idea of writing about turning points it got triggered by those memories. Mm-hmm. And I just started to put major turning points I had navigated throughout my life, starting with a very traumatic event when I was a 7-year-old, where my sister has an accident. She's 2 years old. I'm 7 years old, and we're traveling in Mexico. And the first chapter talks about how these beliefs get formed. And they're usually formed after a traumatic event or an experience. In my case, it was trauma. And we're traveling as a family. We're having a good time. We're seeing snow for the first time. And my sister gets cold and she sticks her hands in her pockets, those jackets that have the zippers. And her hands get stuck and she starts walking down the summit and she loses her footing and she hits her head. And because we were at an elevation that was much higher than South Texas, which we're at sea level, being outside of Mexico City, it was dangerous for a 2-year-old to fall asleep. My father, who is a Vietnam vet and a surgeon, knew the dangers all too well. And in his fear of losing my sister, turned to me and said, if your sister dies, it will be your fault. And when I talk about chapter 1, I talk about how in that moment, a belief gets formed of, I don't trust myself to make the right decisions. And my relationships shift dramatically with my siblings. Now they've become my responsibility, and I'm only 7 years old. And so at that point of trauma, I've formed all these beliefs that are simply not true. And they form themselves to protect us at the moment of trauma. But as we grow older, they sabotage us along the way in our relationships and our finances. And this one sabotaged me not just in my love relationships with other men, but in my financial relationship. And I go through life and I journey through life and Journey to Me. So what I'm doing in Journey to Me is I'm journeying through all these traumatic events, all these turning points, and I'm journeying all the way towards my divine soul's purpose. So what I'm doing is I'm giving you the blueprint of what I used in my own life so that you can journey to joy faster than I did, because I took major exit highways along the way, because
that's not
very
normal.
stubborn. I'm a very stubborn child of God, and I refused to listen to those promptings early on, and I overthought everything. So my ego was always playing a role here. And so Journey to Me it's got several themes in it. The main one is when you navigate change to get to joy faster, turn to God for guidance, for He will lead you to your light. That's the number one theme. And more importantly is that turning points can be life-changing. You really can use change as an opportunity to shift the lens of your life. You don't need to stay where you're at. It's a time of reflection. It's a time to look at your life and say, what choices have I made? What has gotten me to this point in my life? What can I do differently? All those questions can be something that you can prompt. And the book kind of has a workbook built into it so that you can ask yourself those prompting questions. You can use scripture and ask yourself those deeper questions that only you can ask yourself.
Okay. And then your other book, Her Badass Story. Can you tell us in a nutshell what that's about?
Those are 11 authors that collaborated in that book. And so each of us were responsible for our chapter. And my chapter talked about the miraculous story of receiving 3 miracles in 72 hours. And I do it in a nutshell. And I share the blueprint I shared in Journey to Me of how you can turn from the point of turning point. There's 5 cycles of transformation that I discuss in Journey to Me. And I do the same in Her Badass Story, all the way towards her soul identity. Because in what I've found through everything I've lived through and everything I've learned as a coach is that as you navigate change, you've got 2 identities kind of battling it out. You've got your ego identity, which is when we hit deception and we start making changes in our life, and then our mind gets involved and our fear starts to whisper in our ear, and we fall backwards instead of forwards. And you have your soul identity, which is the identity you were born, that person you were born to be, and that beautiful light you were, and that beautiful baby you were, how curious you were about life, how fearless you were before trauma and childhood experiences started to shape the way you saw life. And so they kind of battle it out. And I kind of share with you some techniques on how to interrupt those thoughts that can get in your way and continue pushing forward past all the way towards that identity that's waiting for you, that identity that is so full of joy and happiness and a deeper relationship with yourself and with your higher source of power, which in my case is God.
Okay. And then you have another book, Cracking the Rich Code. Is that also an anthology?
That is also a collaborative book, and I wrote my 1 chapter, and I kind of shared that transition from corporate America to author, because that was a big jump for someone like me, who was a high achiever, who had tied her worth to the size of her paycheck. And when you become a stay-at-home parent and you lose that, you can lose your identity in the process. And to regain and to understand how to step into that divine soul's purpose is really the journey I take you on in Cracking the Rich Code. So it's more a personal empowerment chapter with undertones of finance built into it, because Cracking the Rich Code, as it states, a lot of the entrepreneurs that were invited to author their chapters have a theme of finance in the background.
Oh, I see. Okay. Oh, very interesting, eclectic approach here. That's really good. We got money and spirituality and mental health, and of course physical health with your miracles in the hospital. All right, so tell us more about, well, did your miracles and the traumas you've had in your life, is that your why behind what you're doing now in coaching? Yes,
because it has been, I went back, and interestingly that you asked me that question, because I'm actually participating myself in a mastermind. As coaches, we're always encouraged to get coached ourselves. And for the last 4 months, I've been involved with a mastermind myself, and we were identifying who really is who we're meant to work with. And that's a scary question sometimes for entrepreneurs, because our lives, we start off where we're comfortable, but that's not where we end up. I started off in sales and leadership, and then I started to shift out of there. The why came from reflecting on a chapter I was writing for a third collaborative book, which will be released in January. And that is to inspire first-time authors to write their book. And all of us are authors who are writing our chapters as to how our books came to life and onto the market. And one of the stories was of sitting outside that movie theater and watching Eat, Pray, and Love. And when I looked at the description of Eat, Pray, and Love, I got chills, because that was the first time I heard that prompting. And it was the first clue God was giving me of, this is your divine soul's purpose. You're not just to become an author. You are to help people who are in deep spiritual change. Because if you read the description of Eat, Pray, and Love, that is exactly what it talks about. And I seriously, the hairs in the back of my neck stood up as I read that. The description of the movie. And I thought, he was giving me clues even then, and I didn't catch it. Until now, right? And so the why comes about because I've transitioned successfully from being a high achiever who felt she was not enough, who felt that her achievements equated to her happiness. And when I got there, I realized that was such a big fat lie I had believed for so long. And now I want to help women who are in deep spiritual change, who are wanting a deeper relationship with self and with their higher source of power, and with their divine soul's purpose, who are really interested in a second act, who know they are in the wrong job, but because of their belief systems, they're there. But they feel this pull to act in a different way, much like I did. I help them understand what that pull means and how to interrupt those thoughts that keep them from really fulfilling their divine soul's purpose.
And you do this through coaching? Do you also use any kind of courses?
Not yet, because I've been busy writing. As you know, writing a book, it's a huge commitment, and it is a very long-term affair if you want to do it correctly. And for me, it was all of 2020 and 2021 it was finally released. But 2020 was tough because it was pandemic times and our kids were home and we were teachers. And I was not only the teacher to a 5-year-old, but I was now the author of a book that was being given to me via download. So I had to sit quietly and for 2 hours every morning, starting at 5 a.m., write, whether I felt like it or not. So I haven't really sat down to look at courses, but I do know that people have asked me, why haven't you created a course that would be an awesome course? Because I used to do videos and they love the videos. They said, just combine, combine all your body of work into a course. And I think it'd be great.
I hear you. I also have lots of course ideas. It's just finding the little pieces of time to make it happen. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. What else do I want to ask you? Oh, so I'm guessing after you lived, your family really celebrated you. What was that like? Or did they start treating you back to normal? Like, oh, she's all right.
She's all right. Well, you know what? My mom, like I said, I've had such a wonderful relationship with my mom. And I get emotional talking about her. I mean, she's still alive and I'm going to see her at Christmas. But she is such a wonderful human being. She came and lived literally at my house for weeks after I was released from the hospital. She would spend the night with me because I was so afraid. It really triggered my anxiety and OCD. I mean, it got triggered immensely after that near-death experience, because the what if, the small person, I became that statistic I used to talk about as a pharmaceutical rep. I mean, that itty bitty, less than 1% getting pulmonary embolisms. And I became that statistic because I had started dating my boyfriend, and being a good Mexican girl, did not want to get pregnant. And I started taking birth control pills. Little would I know that that would be the least of my worries. It would have been such a blessing. So my parents treated me like a miracle, honestly. And a lot of my friends started to treat me like that, like, wow, you should have died like 4 times and you didn't. And so there's a powerful reason why you survived. Not only did it trigger my OCD and anxiety, but I also had survivor's guilt, because I knew that young people had died from just one, and I had survived and I had multiple. And I think it's a very human thing to feel.
Welcome back, Sylvia. I know we had a little snafu tech-wise, but let's pick up from when you were mentioning how your parents treated you after you survived. I want to hear more about that.
They treated me like a miracle, like this phenomena, because I had become a statistic in their mind of like, wow, she was at less than 1%. She got this horrible thing. She had 20% chance of surviving. She wasn't expected to survive. She should have died really 4 or 5 times. And I didn't. And so the powerful thing that comes from that realization is, why? Why do I survive? Do I survive because I'm meant to, because I have a deeper purpose and I'm currently living? And so I start reflecting on that immensely. And what I find is that God has been giving me clues along the way. He's been equipping me for what's coming. And now it starts to make me question life a little bit on a deeper level. I'm not happy where I'm at. I'm there because growing up, I didn't feel enough. And I thought that if I achieved, I would get my father's attention. And the more I achieved, the less I really got his attention, and the more I felt not enough. So I kept that cycle going for a long time. So I was in a life that I was never meant to live in, but by my beliefs, it steered me there. So now I'm interrupting those beliefs. I'm at that point in my life, and my parents are supportive. They're very supportive. But they're shocked that, quite frankly, that I survived at all. And they're very grateful to God because I did. And my mom spends weeks with me. I would take a couple of steps, and I know this is hard for some people to hear. I couldn't even catch my breath. It was humbling. I mean, I'd gone from like 7 days of exercising every day for a week, weeks on end, and never going out of breath, to like walking a couple of steps and needing to take a seat because I couldn't catch my breath. But I was so grateful that I was able to survive such a traumatic event. And I was grateful for the reflection it brought me, because I did start to reflect very deeply, and my relationship with God deepened even more so. It shifted dramatically from just believing in him to trusting him. So I started to hear his voice come more frequently because I was tuning into it more now that I had survived.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, I bet you got more presents during the holidays too.
I had friends that would come up to me and want to touch me and be like, you're like a good luck charm. And I'm like, well, yeah, I guess now. And they were always wanting to be around me because it was such a miraculous story. And it was such a beautiful story that I really needed to put on paper, honestly. So I'm glad I felt that prompting and that pull to do that for her badass story.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it brings people, especially after pandemic times, some hope that relationships can be deeper with yourself and with God. And He's always there, no matter what is happening in your life. You're never alone. You never journey alone, even when you feel so out of control, like I did in those moments, those terrifying moments of just receiving that news and everything that comes with it.
Yeah. Okay. Tell us a little more about the masterminds that you're involved in. Do you run your own masterminds or you attend masterminds?
I attend masterminds because that's being a trained speaker, coach, and trainer with the John Maxwell team. That is a recommendation when we first get certified. Always get coached. You all have blind spots too. You got to get coached. And this mastermind that I'm currently involved with myself is for faith-driven entrepreneurs. So I'm really in this space where I'm thriving immensely because I'm a faith-driven entrepreneur, and I'm an entrepreneur because of my survival from pulmonary embolisms. The joy in the journey and the freedom from fear masterminds that I'm currently creating are the ones that I'm doing based on Journey to Me. And what I'm doing is I'm pulling certain chapters because certain chapters talk about lessons learned, lessons that God used to equip me for what was coming down my path and how they actually helped me. Even the traumatic event in Mexico City, I learned a very valuable lesson in responsibility. So when I create masterminds, and I used to do them for the John Maxwell team with John Maxwell's books, I will do no more than 7 to 8 people in a group, because then it gives everybody a chance to be able to speak in the 90 minutes that we meet once a week. And I had it for 6 weeks, but since taking the mastermind myself and being with other entrepreneurs, I found that it's probably best to extend that to 12 weeks as opposed to 6, to do it double, so they can actually start to see the change in themselves, and they gain that momentum that's very needed to keep pushing past the deception that is very common when you start incorporating very big change in your life. And so I tailor it depending on the group and depending on the themes that the group that I identify are the group's biggest challenges, if you will. And Journey to Me is very flexible because it's got several lessons that, I shared 15 chapters. There's a lesson in authenticity and how to be your authentic self as a woman after an identity crisis. So you're transitioning from and going into a second act, for example, chapter 13 would be ideal to cover because it's talking about going on artist dates with yourself and really identifying what brings you joy as an individual, to fall in love with yourself again, to really understand and be clear on what that beautiful vision looks like. Because when we start change, we often forget that we're operating at a subconscious level. And we really need to understand how to work with our subconscious mind so it doesn't use the limiting beliefs that's stored in there to steer our choices. And we're clearly not aware why we're doing certain things, but it's what we've known all along. And so that's why we don't ever truly change or incorporate change. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I tailor it depending on what the themes are. And I do that based on interviews. I do a lot of research at the beginning when I form these groups, and I ask a lot of questions, and I get to understand what the greatest challenges are, and then we'll go from there.
Okay.
So it's tailored.
Yeah, it sounds like it's not only tailored, but it's action oriented.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. I give them tools and tips to start applying in their lives right away. Very relatable, very applicable tools and tips, which is what is incorporated in Journey to Me inside the book, that workbook piece that is at the end of each chapter. It is all these very easy to follow tips.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I want to swing back to your personal life a little bit, if you allow me.
Of course.
And of course, bow out if this is asking too much, but I am curious. I wonder if the audience is curious about your relationship with your dad. You know, that was a hard moment in Mexico, and then hard moments trying to please him. Is he, still with us?
Yes, he's alive.
Okay. And how are you two getting along nowadays?
After I wrote Journey to Me, very well. It was a very healing process for me because I was able to see on paper and appreciate on paper what fear looked like for him, because he did not do it to be mean. Mm-hmm. He did it out of fear of losing my sister. He unfortunately attached that fear to me into a comment I had made on the way up the summit. I had been the stubborn child because I was very strong-willed, and I am still to this day. And I'm paying for that dearly because I have an 8-year-old who's very strong-willed. So, it's all coming full circle.
There's some strengths in this. I had this exact same conversation with a client this morning, the strengths of being stubborn.
And I love it because there's so many beautiful things to it, because you're someone that's going to get far in life because you're not going to quit very easily. Right? So I put my hands on my hips. My dad said, we need to start climbing down. I think people are like, the elevation's getting to some of us, And I told him, I said, you woke us up at 5 a.m. I want to see snow. I've never seen snow. We lived in South Texas. There's no snow down there. And he just kind of gave in to my whim. So when that happened with my sister, he kind of inadvertently blamed me. And how many times as parents have we made the mistake of making a comment that can really harm and hurt our children, and we're not meaning it with that intention. But what we don't realize is that what he didn't realize at the time, even being a doctor, is that he transferred his responsibility, his parental responsibility, onto his 7-year-old child. And that's huge, because I basically lost my childhood. I stopped being a kid. I didn't know how to be a kid. I was so traumatized by that moment. And obviously my sister physically survives the accident, and I don't emotionally. So in answer to your question, it's been a long road to get to where we're at with my dad. I've always adored my father. I get emotional, so I apologize.
Yeah, it's okay. And you don't have to answer either.
No. I totally want to, and I'll tell you why. Because I see so many people losing time, being angry and resentful based on one comment. And I will tell you that I lost so many years. And now I'm playing catch up, and now my dad's in his 80s. So for those listening, if you find yourself in a similar situation, my greatest advice to you is forgive and release all those feelings of resentment and anger to God, because he will take them from you, because it is completely blocking that amazing light that exists inside of you. When you forgive, you are giving that gift to yourself. It's not for the other person, it's for you. You're the one that's being held captive by all these feelings and these fears and these beliefs, and they're simply not true. I also, in chapter 1, I also talked about my father's abusive background. His father was a verbally and physically abusive alcoholic who used to beat up his mom in front of them. And my father eventually went and lived with a maternal aunt who raised him, who never married. So that was her only child, was my dad. And he got very lucky in that regard. And then he met my mother, who is just a wonderful human being. And it's interesting, because now when I get, sometimes those feelings come up for me, and I just, what I do to interrupt it, Karen, I visualize my dad as a little boy witnessing that abuse.
Yeah. Generational trauma.
And I hug him and I say, Daddy, it's okay. Yeah. You're safe. And I forgive you, because he didn't know any better. He was not aware. It was a subconscious reaction. And when I became a coach, I started to understand the power of the subconscious mind and just how unaware we are as human beings unless we dive deep into those questions. And a lot of people, that's what scares them about therapy and about coaching, is that they're going to dive into these what they call rabbit holes, but I call them joy holes, because you find so much joy when you uncover all that fear, when you just release all that fear and stop it from like covering up the joy and the happiness that we're all born with, that is accessible to us inside of us. But because our fear is so great and our anger and the resentment so great, it plucks it and it sabotages you. So right now, after I wrote it, I could see my relationship with my dad. It was so different, Karen. I can go to him, I kiss him, I hug him, I joke around with him. There's no more tension. Years ago, even 2 years ago, I couldn't say that. I couldn't be in the same room. I just could not. I would get so angry. I was so resentful. And it just started to shift. I'm so grateful, because I think it's God's way of giving me a chance to mend before my dad passes away. And
it's beautiful.
What a gift. What a gift.
Was part of the forgiveness cycle forgiving yourself?
Yes. And to this day, it's still continuing, because there's so much that we carry, as moms. When I divorced my first husband asked for a divorce, I carried so much shame and guilt. And I took so much responsibility. I mean, to excessively too much responsibility, that it became toxic in me. And so this chapter of my life, in these last couple of months, God has been guiding me towards forgiving and releasing shame, guilt, anger, all those things that were just blocking that beautiful light that is just not in alignment with the person He needs me to be. Just like that. I
love that to be my last question. I think self-forgiveness is huge. However, I don't want you to feel anything's unsaid. So if there's any words of wisdom, any guidance that you want to provide listeners now that may be suffering from a trauma or an illness, or just really struggling, any words that you want to share?
Of course. And I thank you so much for the opportunity of being on here today with you and your listeners. I do want to say a couple of words regarding self-love. It is the greatest gift to see yourself, to love yourself the way that God loves you, to see that beautiful person that you were created to be, and to discover those gifts inside of you, those gifts that you're meant to use for the betterment of humanity. I mean, really, with everything this world has endured in the last couple of years, it is important for you to remember that you are so worth it to go and get the help that you need. Don't do this alone. First of all, you're never alone. God is always with you. He's always there for you to turn to in times of this enormous change and stress. Second, there's always people around you that love you, that you mean something to. And there are other solutions than suicide. Suicide is not a solution. We need your light. We need your gifts. And we're waiting. We're patiently and joyfully waiting for you to forgive yourself and to love yourself the way you deserve to. Thank you.
That was really beautiful, Sylvia. Thank you for being here today.
Oh, it was such a gift to be here with you, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you for listening in today. Please join us next week, same day and time. Also, I would love for you to check out my website, healthrivedream.com.